Here's a business that owned 12 million square kilometers of the planet. It ran 110 million people across 4 continents. It was the second largest empire on Earth, behind only the British. And here's the strange part. For most of its life, it lost money. Not for everyone. A small group of firms and families got extremely rich, but the state kept sending the bill to its own taxpayers. Britain built a machine that paid for itself. France built something different, a machine that privatized the profit and socialized the cost. This is not a story about flags, generals, and civilizing missions. This is the ledger, where the money came from and who paid. Start with the rulebook, because this empire began as a set of trade laws. It was called the exclusive, and it was brutally simple. A colony could sell its goods to one buyer only, France. It could buy manufactured goods from one seller only, France. Foreign ships were banned from colonial ports. Local manufacturing was banned outright. Sugar had to be refined in Bordeaux, not where the cane grew. That single rule decided where value was added and where the money stayed. The colonies supplied the raw material. France supplied the price. Colbert, the finance minister of Louis XIV, designed this as national policy. Ports like Nantes and Bordeaux were built on it, and the system had one asset that outperformed everything else on Earth: Saint-Domingue, the western third of one Caribbean island. Today, Haiti. It was about the size of a small French province, and it produced this: around 40% of all the sugar consumed in Europe, around 60% of the world's coffee supply in 1789, 800 sugar plantations, roughly 3,000 coffee plantations, indigo, cotton, cacao. This one colony out-earned all 13 British American colonies combined. Its exports were roughly 2/3 of France's entire overseas trade. Some estimates put the French livelihoods touching that trade in the millions. One island, a quarter of French commerce running through it. Here's how that number was actually produced, stated plainly. In 1789, the colony held around 500,000 enslaved people. They were roughly 90% of the population. Life expectancy on the sugar plantations was often under 10 years. That was not a failure of the system, it was an input assumption. These plantations were not built to sustain a workforce. They consumed one. Replacements were bought. This was the largest single slave market in the world. The colony's value was calculated with the people themselves listed as assets. In 1791 valuations, they made up over 3/4 of it. Sugar was the product. The accounting instrument was a human being. In August 1791, the machine stopped because the people inside stopped it. What began as an uprising in the northern plain became a 13-year war. It defeated the French, then the Spanish, then the British, then Napoleon's expedition. In 1804, it declared independence as Haiti. France had just lost the most profitable single property in the Atlantic world. Sugar output collapsed by over 90% within a decade. The French ports built on that trade never recovered their position. Cuba and Brazil moved in and took the sugar market. And here, France made the decision that defines this entire story. It did not accept the loss, it sent an invoice. In 1825, a French squadron appeared off Port-au-Prince. The offer was recognition. The price was 150 million gold francs. Compensation, France said, for property lost in the revolution. The property was people. The first installment alone was several times Haiti's entire state revenue. Haiti could not pay, so it borrowed from French banks to pay France. That is the double debt, the indemnity plus the loan taken to service it. In 1838, the remainder was reduced, but the loans kept compounding. By 1914, repayments were eating a very large share of Haiti's budget. The final payment on that chain was made in 1947 to a New York bank. 122 years of a country paying for its own freedom. In 2022, a New York Times team rebuilt the payments from archives. Haiti transferred roughly 112 million francs in indemnity payments. In today's money, that is about $560 million actually paid. But money that leaves is not the damage. The damage is money that never compounds. Economists in that study estimated the lost growth at over $20 billion. Higher estimates run past $100 billion. The range is contested, the mechanism is not. In 2025, France set up a joint historians commission on the indemnity. 200 years later, the ledger on this one is still open. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the empire had already changed shape because Napoleon had worked out what colonies were really for. Napoleon's economics were simple. War is expensive, and empire is a way to fund it. In 1803, he sold Louisiana to the United States, 2 million square kilometers, for roughly 80 million francs. He sold a third of a continent to pay for a European war. Then he tried the opposite instrument, the continental system, from 1806. Close every European port to British goods and starve the competitors' market. It did not work as designed. French raw cotton imports fell sharply. Smuggling filled the gap and French coastal cities lost their shipping. The lesson France took was not that blockades fail. The lesson was that a captive market is worth having, preferably one you own, which brings us to the most honest origin story in colonial history. In the 1790s, France bought enormous quantities of grain from two Algiers houses, Bakri and Bousnache. The money was borrowed on the credit of the Dey of Algiers. France then spent 30 years refusing to settle the bill. In 1827, the Dey asked the French consul about it one more time. The consul was evasive. The Dey struck him with a fly whisk. France declared an insult to national honor and blockaded the port for 3 years. In June 1830, 37,000 troops landed near Algiers. The city fell in 3 weeks and the army seized the treasury of the Regency. A state invaded its own creditor and confiscated the money. That is the founding transaction. Conquest is a cost. Land is the asset that pays it back. So Algeria was converted, law by law, into transferable French property. Collective and tribal landholding did not fit the French civil code, so it was dismantled. The Senatus Consultae of 1863 split collective land into divisible parcels. The Warnier Law of 1873 applied French property law directly. Religious endowment land went to the state. Communal land became purchasable. This is not a footnote. This is the entire mechanism. You need not steal land if you redefine ownership so it cannot be held. By the 20th century, settlers worked over 2 million hectares of the best coastal land. The people who had farmed it were pushed onto thinner, drier ground. Push subsistence farmers onto marginal land and you have engineered a fragile system. In 1867 and 68, drought and locusts hit. That fragility turned into mortality on an enormous scale. Estimates of the dead run from several 100,000 to about 1 million. The figures are argued over. The structure that produced them is not. Then came the legal architecture, the Indigena Code, formalized in 1881. It created 2 classes of person under one flag, French citizens with rights and native subjects with obligations. Subjects could be punished administratively without a trial for offenses citizens never faced, and they carried taxes designed to push them into the cash economy. This next mechanism ran the whole empire, so look at it closely. A head tax is imposed, and it has to be paid in French currency. A subsistence farmer has no French currency. He has the food he grew, so he must sell something for francs or work for wages paid in francs. The tax is not mainly about revenue. It manufactures a labor force, and it manufactures cash crops, cotton, groundnuts, coffee, rubber. On top of tax came prestation, compulsory unpaid days of labor on public works. In West and Central Africa, forced labor stayed legal until 1946. The empire did not need market wages because it wrote the market's rules. And in one colony, France industrialized this idea completely. French Indochina was officially designated a colony d'exploitation, a colony for extraction. Governor General Paul Doumer arrived in 1897 with a budget problem. He solved it with three state monopolies: opium, salt, and rice alcohol. The state bought raw opium, refined it in Saigon, and sold it through licensed shops. Salt is not optional. Neither, in practice, was the alcohol regime that replaced local production. In 1920, those three monopolies produced roughly 44% of the colonial budget. Opium alone averaged about 20% of general budget revenue for 2 decades. Vietnamese called them the three beasts of burden: a colonial state financed by addiction and a mineral the body cannot live without. And on paper, Indochina balanced its books. That was the entire point. Extraction needs two more things: plantations and transport. The French car industry needed rubber, so rubber covered southern Indochina. Workers signed multi-year contracts they often could not read. Mortality on some plantations became a political scandal in France itself. In Central Africa, the same logic produced the Congo Ocean Railway. 500 kilometers through rainforest and mountain, dug largely by hand. Over 100,000 people were conscripted to build it. At least 20,000 died. Some estimates are considerably higher. André Gide traveled there and described the project as a consumer of human lives. The line carried timber and minerals to the coast. That was its purpose. Now, the question this whole video exists to answer: did France get rich? In 1984, the historian Jacques Marseille opened the accounts. 469 colonial companies, trade data from 1880 to 1960. His conclusion was not the one he expected to find. The empire was not the engine of French capitalism. It was a weight on it. Here is why. In 1930, the colonies absorbed half of France's cotton fabric exports, 60% of its cement, a third of its machines, tools, and cars. Read that again. Those are the products France could not sell in open markets. The colonies were a guaranteed customer for industries falling behind Britain and Germany. Protected demand does not force modernization. It removes the reason to modernize. Meanwhile, the state was carrying the costs. A recent reconstruction of the public accounts puts French spending on the empire around 1.3% of national output. 4/5 of that money was military. The colonies ran chronic trade deficits, covered mostly by soldiers' pay spent locally. This was not a pipeline of colonial tax into Paris. It was a garrison economy. Private firms took the profitable slices: banks, shipping, plantations, mining concessions. The French taxpayer funded the army that made those slices possible. Then the wars came and the arithmetic broke completely. Indochina, 1946 to 54, ended at Dien Bien Phu. Algeria, 1954 to 62, cost France a war and a republic. Estimates of the Algerian death toll range from several hundred thousand to over 1 million. In 1962, Algeria became independent and the formal empire was finished. Then something inconvenient for the imperial theory happened. In the decade after the colonies left, French growth was the strongest in its modern history. De Gaulle's position was blunt. Decolonization is our interest, therefore it is our policy. But the financial architecture did not leave when the flags came down. In 1945, France created the CFA franc for its African territories: fixed exchange rate, convertibility guaranteed by France, reserves deposited with the French treasury. For decades, member central banks kept a large share of their reserves in Paris. 14 countries still use it today, now pegged to the euro. In 2019, the West African bloc agreed to end the reserve deposit and rename the currency. That renaming still has not been completed, and the peg to the euro remains. The 6 Central African states still operate under the older arrangement, and the notes are still printed in France. So here is the final accounting without the flags. For a narrow set of French firms, planters, and banks, the empire produced real fortunes. For the French state, it produced prestige, an army abroad, and a very long bill. For the colonized, it produced taken land, engineered taxes, forced labor, and lost industry. And for one country, an invoice for its own independence that took 122 years to clear. Britain built an empire that made money. France built one that made claims. The difference is that the claims are still being paid.